Hello VCA625, my name is Kate Wilson, and I decided that we should start off our lecture series with something simple, something really easy to understand. Lacanian theory. Lacanian theory, honestly, is the most difficult theory that I've come across my time here at Central. It has a lot to do with Freudian theory. It's really an extension of Freudian theory. Jacques Lacan wrote in a very complicated way. He used a lot of mathematical equations, and it tackles some really abstract thinking about identification and symbolic order of life. But there's a really great film that I love. It's one of my favorite films called Dogtooth, and we'll use that to highlight Lacanian theory and discuss how the film really works as a parable for Lacanian theory. So like I said, the Lacanian theory is an extension of Freudian psychoanalysis, and it has special attention paid to the development of language and how language shapes the growth of the child. Now, if you think of Freudian theory, he was really focused on the development of the child, and Freud believed that every problem that we have as an adult stems back to something that happened in childhood throughout our development. Lacan agreed with Freud in this way, but he looked at it as more of a problem with the way that we develop our language. Lacan looked at the family structure as very similar to the social structure of life. You have the government, you have education systems. All systems of power are basically large versions of the family structure. And Lacan wanted to really dive into identification of the self, of the child, and how language shapes the way that we develop as people. If you've seen the film Dogtooth, you know that the film is about a family that develops language in a very interesting way. We'll get into that in just a bit, but first let's talk a little bit about the history of Lacan and his life as a French analyst. So beginning in the early 1950s, he focused on revisiting Freudian analysis and how language or linguistics relate to the psychological development. Where Freud focused on the imagery of the subconscious, Lacan asserted that the unconscious is structured like a language itself. It's not separate from the conscious ego, but just has a more complex language that we experience in our conscious state. Now let's briefly discuss some of the elements of Lacanian theory and talk about some of the tools we'll need to properly analyze Dogtooth. Probably the most popular aspect of Lacan's theory is the mirror stage. Lacan was really interested in that first moment when an infant child sees their image in a mirror. Now, if you think about a small dog or a kitten, when they look into the mirror, they don't necessarily connect with the image in the mirror. There's something special that we know for sure happens with humans, where we look into the mirror and we learn to connect that image we see outside of ourselves with everything that's going on inside of our head. This mirror stage is sort of bridging the gap between what's happening inside our head and how we exist in the world outside of our head. When an infant stumbles upon a mirror, she is suddenly bombarded with an image of herself as whole, whereas she previously experienced existence as a fragmented entity with libidinal needs. A fragmented entity basically means little pieces of information. Before you start to realize that you are a person, you're probably just getting little blips of information. I'm hungry, I'm tired, this feels uncomfortable. But none of that relates back to the self. When we're very small, we're not thinking, I'm hungry, I'm tired. It's more instinctual. That mirror stage is what is very important in our becoming self-reflexive beings, or being able to think of ourselves subjectively. The mirror stage represents the infant's first encounter with subjectivity, spatial relations, or where they exist in the world, and the idea of a you and an I, external from what's going on in our head. The image in the mirror represents our coherence of the world around us and solidifies ourselves as complete subjects within the external world. That's all very abstract, but it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. We have a whole lot of stuff going on inside of our head all the time, and there's no real way that we can connect with the outside world unless we see ourselves as a part of it. So when we look into the mirror, we see an image of ourselves that isn't actually us, but what represents us, and the way that it reflects tells us about ourselves. Very complicated stuff, but that's just a brief explanation. The next aspect of the theory I'd like to talk about is the Lacanian triad. Now, this triad stems right from the mirror stage. We all know that Freud focuses on his own triad, the ego, superego, and the id. Lacan devised his own made up of what he called the symbolic, the real, and the imaginary. Where Freud was focusing on different levels of awareness, Lacan was focused on different levels of meaning. And this meaning exists only in our own minds. Together they create a system of perception and help us dialogue with the outside world. Now, Lacan would say that the triad, symbolic, real, and imaginary, developed as a direct reflection of the mirror stage. After we realize that we exist in the outside world, when we see ourselves as a baby looking back at us through a mirror, we have to develop some way to communicate with the outside world in a way that when we communicate, our needs are met and our thoughts are able to sort of escape our head. Now, this symbolic, real, imaginary trio relates very well to media, especially if you think about it as a border between internal and external. Because when we consume media, especially powerful emotional films or television, we are connecting with it internally and externally. To explain this trio, let's talk about a red bicycle. If I have a red bicycle, the real meaning of the bicycle is that it is red. The real level of meaning for Lacan has to do with the properties of the object. So my bicycle is red. It has a certain brand of tires. It has 10 speeds. And it might have a basket on the front. Those are all real properties of the object. The second level, the symbolic, has to do with social implications of that object. So what does the bicycle say about me as a person? When I'm in society, out and about, and other people see me riding my red bike, what do they think about? Someone might think, she's getting exercise. Or they might think, she has a bike because she can't afford a car. Those are all elements of the symbolic level of meaning. Now, the imaginary level of meaning is a little more complicated because it has to do with our own self-experience of the object. What does the bicycle mean to me? The bicycle might represent my own freedom, my ability to connect with nature, or explore the world from a different perspective. It might even connect to childhood memories of riding bikes with my family on bike trails around by the lake. And that might bring me comfort, which is why I have my own bike. That's the imaginary level. So again, the real has to do with the properties of the object, the color of the bicycle. The symbolic has to do with the social implications, what message the bicycle sends about me. And the imaginary has to do with one's self-experience of the object. What does the bicycle mean to me? Okay, if you're still with me, we have a couple more things to talk about before we get into the analysis of the film. We all know the Oedipal complex from Freud. Freud says the Oedipal complex is a stage of child's development in which the child experiences an erotic attachment toward one parent and hostility toward the other. This tension between the triangle is a key element in the psychological development of the individual. When you think about Freud, a lot of people kind of say, man, this guy talks about penises a whole lot. And that's true. But I think a good way to look at Freud is not literal. So when he's talking about penis or phalluses, I think he's more talking about power structures. The penis, in a way, is symbolic of power as it stands in the patriarchal familial structure. If we think about the patriarchal familial structure, or a family led by a patriarchal figure, the power has to do with the dad. And when you're a child, what defines your dad from your mother? His genitals. I think that's where Freud was getting his obsession with penises, but that's a whole other thing. The Oedipal stage is the cause of castration anxiety for male children, or the fear of his father castrating him due to sexual interest in his mother, and penis envy for female children, or the desire to possess a penis due to her lack. Again, if we replace penis with power, it makes a little more sense. Of course, when you're a young boy and you're growing up, you're going to want to be just like your dad, and eventually you might even be stronger than your dad and question why you're not the head of the household. Conversely, if you are a young girl, you might wonder why you could never be the head of the family, and you might feel that you lack something, or lack a certain power in the society that you're being raised. Lacan takes this even farther away from Freudian's idea of the Oedipal complex. He believes that the process of moving through the Oedipal stage has more to do with a child learning the need to obey the father, rather than actually wanting to sleep with your mom and kill your father. So in Lacanian theory, the father represents the paternal metaphor. The paternal metaphor consists of all of the social structures and restraints that we learn as a child. Now, of course, there are laws in our land. We are human beings that have created a huge list of rules and regulations, things you can and can't do. In the Lacanian Oedipal stage, the symbolic father is comparable to the structures that dictate our actions, such as law, religion, medicine, or education. So Lacan did not take the Oedipal stage as literally as Freud. Lacan focused more on the idea of a family unit being symbolic of a greater societal structure. We are born into a family that has a certain hierarchical power structure. When we turn 18 and move out of the house, we are again put into a hierarchical system with a patriarchal power structure. The last thing we'll talk about is Lacanian phobia. Lacan believes that phobia is a way to deal with anxiety surrounding the father-mother-child situation, transforming this Oedipal fear into the fear of a specific object. For example, Freud published a case study on a boy named Hans. Hans had developed an intense phobia of horses, which Freud surmised was symbolic of Hans' own castration anxiety. This fear of a horse biting him was directly related to the fear of his father castrating him due to his intense love for his mother. Lacan believes that the function of phobia is sort of to serve as a stand-in for the paternal metaphor. So when we talk about the paternal metaphor, again, we're talking about the power structure. We're talking about the government, the law, or the father figure. In Dogtooth, the phobia is entirely constructed by the paternal figure, with help from the mother. The greatest fear lies in the outside world. The father indoctrinates the children with stories of the dangers that lurk, and that if you stay inside, you are protected. In this film, the father is establishing a symbolic world in which the family is completely enclosed by phobic logic. This is exactly what Lacan is talking about the family being symbolic of the greater order of our society. The film Dogtooth is all about a family and the way that they interact with one another. The biggest thing is that children are never allowed to leave the house, nor is the mother. The family is guarded by the outside world through a physical fence surrounding the premises, as well as protection from outside meaning, or what we call signifiers. In this situation, the phobia is forced by the paternal metaphor, or the character of the father. He forces the children to be terrified of anything in the outside world, and he does this in quite a few ways. First, the children are introduced to the myth of the dogtooth. The dogtooth functions as a solution to a situation that is closed. They can never leave the premises, but why? It is not until the child loses their dogtooth that they will be equipped to leave the home without fear of death. They are ingrained with this idea that they have to wait for their dogtooth before they can leave the house, or else they're going to get totally destroyed in the outside world. This myth serves as a reason why the children cannot leave, and again functions as a solution to this situation that has been created by the paternal phobic logic. The second way that the father constructs this phobia is through their unseen brother. We're introduced to the idea of an imaginary brother who has escaped from the premises years ago. He lives right outside the garden, and the children are often seen feeding him or talking to him. The father uses this brother as a sort of cautionary tale for the children, explaining that if they leave the home, they will suffer the same fate as their brother. He even goes as far as to fake the death of this brother and hold a eulogy on the side of the garden. The third way that the father perpetuates this phobic myth is through introducing the myth of the dangerous cat. We'll discuss that in just a little bit, but let's get deeper into the individual characters present in Dogtooth and how they reflect these Lacanian ideas. We're first introduced to the three children of this family sitting in a bathroom. They're listening to a tape recording of their mother, who is delivering words and their definitions. For example, she explains that a C is a leather armchair with wooden arms, and that an excursion is a heavy metal. From the very beginning, it's apparent that these children are being indoctrinated with real words or signifiers with imaginary meanings or signifieds. The father seems to be an exact recreation of Lacan's paternal metaphor. He is the only member of the house that's allowed to leave the premises. The children and the mother remain at home constantly, surrounded by high gates. The father works in a warehouse, constantly surrounded by phallic symbols of industry. He is the one that delivers punishment and instigates competition between the three children. In many ways, the father treats his family like one would treat a guard dog. In an interesting scene with a dog trainer, the father is confronted with his own parenting techniques. The mother lives at home with the children, watching them constantly. She is always wearing floral print, perhaps symbolic of her position as the epitome of feminine. She works closely with the father to perpetuate their false narrative, which may increase Oedipal anxiety and fear with the children. Whenever the children wonder about the meaning of a word, she answers them and serves as the voice of reason. In one scene, the children are blindfolded and scattered around the family compound. The mother times them with a stopwatch to see who can find her the quickest. The children find her and immediately embrace her. She is the perfect metaphor for the maternal figure in the Lacanian Oedipal complex. Let's talk about two of the children who are the most interesting to discuss. The youngest daughter is also an interesting character, but for the sake of making this short, we'll just focus on the son and the eldest daughter. The son. He is the middle child, though because of the patriarchal order, he is raised to the top of the children's hierarchy. In the second scene of the film, we see the father paying a security guard named Christina to have sex with the son. The sex scene is very childlike and awkward, giving the sense that the son does not fully embrace his own sexuality. There could be many meanings for this. It could be seen as a way for the father to control the son's Oedipal feelings for his mother, or to ensure that the son develops heterosexual desire, in a way confirming that he will be the masculine ideal in a patriarchal society. In one scene, the son wakes up in the middle of the night and gets into bed with his parents. He pushes his mother aside and curls up against his father. This could be symbolic of an infatuation with his father rather than his mother, perhaps a perversion of the Oedipal complex. Immediately following this scene, we see the son, who happens upon a stray cat in the garden. He grabs a pair of garden shears, perhaps a symbol of phallic power, as Freud would say, and brutally guts the cat. The father cuts up his clothes and splatters himself with fake blood, before telling the children that cats are the most dangerous beasts that a man can come across. Perhaps the father is indoctrinating them with the idea that a cat, which symbolizes femininity, is the worst thing that someone can come across. Where the cat may be symbolic of feminine power, the fear of feminine power relates directly to the patriarchal system that the father has created within the family. There can be no feminine power, and all feminine symbols must be destroyed. The most interesting character and the most dynamic character is the eldest daughter. The eldest daughter embodies a questioning of the paternal metaphor's power and authority. She's curious about the outside world and craves to learn about it in any way that she can. She is also constantly overshadowed by her younger brother and often competes with the others to prove her strength. Freud would say, yeah, she's got penis envy. While the son is forced into sexual experimentation with Christina, the eldest finds her own way of experimentation. Christina offers her a gift of her headband in exchange for sexual gratification. The eldest does not seem to connect this experience with Christina to sexuality, but rather learns that it is a way to get information about the outside world and a way to exert power over another person. This is highlighted in a subsequent scene when the eldest asks her younger sister to lick her elbow in exchange for Christina's headband. Throughout the film, the eldest becomes more and more aggressive toward her brother. She cuts him with a kitchen knife, again, symbolic of the phallus, after finding him playing with her toy airplane, which could be a symbol of freedom from the compound. The point of no return for the eldest happens after Christina gives her 2 VHS tapes. These tapes contain Jaws and Rocky. The eldest stays up all night watching these films from the outside world and spends the rest of the film quoting the dialogue and acting out the scenes. She has, as Lacanian would say, come to possess the signifiers of Hollywood cinema, and has also become possessed by their content. She has stepped outside of the phobic closed family unit and has begun to develop her own symbolic self. This is highlighted in a scene where she announces to her sister she wants to be called Bruce. This scene perfectly captures Lacanian's idea of the proper name. If you think about it, our names are words that exist before we're born, but they're inextricably linked to oneself so much that our names eventually stand in for ourselves. When her sister calls her Bruce and the eldest responds to it, the eldest is completing her transformation. The finale of the film shows our newly named Bruce looking at herself in the mirror. She decides that it's time for her dogtooth to fall out, and with it, gain her freedom from the compound. She smashes her mouth with a dumbbell to help the process along. When the eldest removes her dogtooth, she finally views herself in the mirror as her ideal ego. That is, without her tooth, and therefore free from the constraints of her family. This is an interesting final scene, where Bruce is looking directly into the mirror and smiles with a mouthful of blood. The first time we see Bruce, before she becomes Bruce, she's sitting facing away from a mirror. That is to say, she has not fully identified with the mirror stage. She has not completed her transformation into a subject that exists in the outside world. She's been constrained and confined by the phobic, patriarchal metaphor and the system that he has created. Bruce, finally free to leave the compound, climbs into the trunk of her father's car. The film ends with the father driving to work, and the final shot lingers on a closed trunk with Bruce still inside. Although she has become possessed with a foreign identity and the imagery of Hollywood cinema, Bruce is still trapped by the patriarchal forces that she was born into. The eldest daughter's journey can be symbolic of the journey of every child, as seen by Lacanian. She has successfully escaped the structure of the family unit, but her escape only leads her into a wider symbolic structure of power. No matter what we do, we are confined by the words and their meaning, and the construction of the words we learn will always be determined by a higher power, whether that be a father, education system, religious doctrine, or grammatical textbooks. For Lacanian, we are all creatures who cannot escape the symbolic order in which we are born into. We are the subject positioned by the symbolic order, and the meaning we experience is determined by the words that we learn. There is a whole host of other things that happen in Dogtooth that are very interesting and Freudian and super crazy. So if you're interested, definitely check it out. We've only scratched the surface of Lacanian theory, but I think Dogtooth is the perfect example of a metaphor for everything that Lacanian discusses in his theory of the mirror stage, symbolic order, and the paternal metaphor. I hope that helped shed some light on this very confusing and abstract idea. If you have any questions, in-class Kate over there will answer them for you. Thanks for listening, guys.